Welcome to Nexdigm podcast. My name is Sundar. I lead the forensic services at Nexdigm. This podcast is part of the Global Anti-Corruption series. Our podcast is an endeavor to bring up emerging topics of relevance for executives across spectrum of services we offer. Hope you enjoy the podcast. Across the geographies, regulatory environments are changing, business practices are changing, and behaviors are changing with COVID. Anti-corruption in the current environment is bringing newer dimensions with issues around supply chain, healthcare, and other reporting requirements. This also extends to regulatory interventions and the whole new virtual world that we are in. In this podcast series, we will be interviewing specialists across regions to gather specific insights on anti-corruption in current times. The region that we would get covered today is Korea. Today we have with us Jeena. Jeena Kim is a partner of Kim and Lee LLC in Korea. Her practice areas include financial regulation, financial institution merger and acquisition, general corporate legal affairs, international trade and commerce, anti-corruption and economic sanction. She is here to speak about anti-corruption in Korean context. Welcome to the show, Jeena. Pleasure to have you.
Hi, Sundar. It's very honored to be here.
Perfect. So, Jeena, I just wanted to start off with this basic thing. There's a lot of changes that have happened over the past 2-3 months. How do you see the corruption risks have changed at this point in time, and what are your thoughts on that?
I think we can perceive the bifurcated corruption risk in Korea. In a short term, as media reported, the Korean government took a very active countermeasures to combat COVID-19, including social distancing. This would have been effectively deter the interaction among people, which in turn prevented the occurrence of corruption itself. So for example, in the healthcare industry in Korea, we observe minimal promotional activities are taking place, such that the traditional form of corruption in this field that cannot take place. However, in the mid to long term, the corruption risk would be likely increase, mainly because the economy would be plummeted due to COVID-19, and the government stance in this respect would affect the corruption risk as whole. So first of all, the government's action to overcome economic downturn entails huge amount of financial stimulus flooding out into the market. Although this was originally intended to help economically challenged persons or small businesses, such financial resources would become an easy target to the criminals. So in fact, there were some cases in Daegu, the local city of Korea, where COVID-19 hit harshly. Some government officials were involved in a fraudulent scheme to illegally obtain disaster subsidy. Although detailed criminal schemes has not been disclosed to public, and this is a fraud, so strictly speaking, it's not a corruption. But I believe that similar illicit activities entailing corruption and other types of misconduct would likely have happened or will happen in the future. And second, the Korean government have eased or will ease various laws and regulations to better cope with the COVID-19 situation or to facilitate economic recovery. For example, the government utilized certain aspects of laws and regulations in relation to clinical testing to facilitate vaccine or cure development. And such regulatory relaxation would cause some unintended side effects, including corruption. And third, and most importantly, the players in the market would be more willing to take risks to obtain or maintain their businesses, as the economic situation is so challenging. And on the other hand, the aggregating factor is that the government would be less active in enforcement action, at least for a certain period of time, to prioritize economic recovery. Of course, the government may act vigorously in the area closely related to COVID-19. However, in other areas, the government enforcement action could be delayed, or the regulators would be more cautious than before in taking an active stance.
I understand.
So,
I understand.
yeah,
That's a
so
that's an interesting point, Jeena. So to just start with the first context, what I'm seeing is that you're saying that because of COVID, a lot of changes have happened, and the government has taken strict action to address COVID scenario, because of which you're not expecting or anticipating a number of corruption issues which otherwise would have been due to personal contacts that the people had earlier, which is minimal to the current extent. And you also highlighted a very interesting point in terms of enforcement trend. I just want to pause that for the time being. I just want to cover a couple of other thoughts that would be of relevance in this context. One of the things that I wanted to ask is, you did mention about government stimulus packages, etc. Right? So, how is the government touch points changing? See, in typically, if the companies which only had tax related or filing related government touch points now have touch points because of either stimulus and other reasons, right? Do you perceive that to be an opportunity for corruption in the current environment?
That's right. That's right. Because most of those financial stimulus is rather focused on individuals, self-employed persons, or small businesses. Those companies, compared to huge conglomerates or large multinational companies, they lack a certain level of compliance program in place. So. And although the government has posed various requirements in order to obtain a disaster subsidy or other kinds of subsidy, I believe there could be a lot of some loopholes that they can utilize. So as I've mentioned in Daegu, the case was reported as being that the unqualified persons have obtained the subsidy. So that means that all the review process should be done on a document basis, and that document can be easily manipulated and so on.
I
That's
understand. I
right.
understand. See, one of the things that is also relevant in your brief reference that you had given is that you're mentioning that the social distancing norms had helped in reducing the COVID implication, and because there was such an environment, the incidence of corruption would have reduced, right? Do you see that as a factor even in this remote working scenario, which may continue for different regions within Korea, or you think that healthcare focus is going to bring in newer dimensions of corruption in this context?
Okay, so social distancing, as I've mentioned in the first place, that segregated people so that deter the people's interaction, and that becomes kind of a deterrence factor to the occurrence of the corruption itself. But in a long term, that will not be continuing, because in order to stimulate economic recovery, although the COVID-19 situation has not been fully recovered, many government, including Korean government, is prioritizing economic recovery and somewhat easing their social distancing policy, and that impacts. I think the most important aspect here is that the if the corruption happens domestically, then the government would willing to take very active enforcement action. But if it happens abroad, then the government would be less willing to take action, because as you can see in the early days of FCPA enforcement, because the corruption happens abroad, it does not directly, linked to the impact the Korean, domestic matters and the integrity of domestic constituents. So if if it happens abroad, then all the disadvantages impact will occur abroad, and the domestic, there's no domestic issue. So the so the local government or each government would believe that that helps our economic recovery, and all kind of bad effects will remain offshore. So as just like
So you're saying that domestic corruption will be very closely monitored by the governments at
that's
this
right.
point in time, given the economic stimulus or economic regaining that is being planned by the government. But if it is international corruption or foreign corruption, possibly the enforcement rates on this may be much lower.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. So, just wanted to extend this while you have anyways covered it in the previous point. How do you see the enforcement climate changing over the next 6 months to a year? Do you see aggressive enforcement of corruption, or while you mentioned that there's going to be enforcement of domestic corruption cases, are you seeing it to be very aggressive, where the government or the regulator goes behind all those exceptions that they identify, or they're going to be looking at larger cases?
I think that up until now, it has been publicly disclosed that the government is taking a rather lenient stance with respect to all kinds of criminal issues. And for example, our customs office, they officially did not take on-site audit. They delay the process and they only review the documents only. But now they are actually going into the site to review all, whether there is any customs illicit activities or not. That means up until now, like 2 or 3 months, Korean government's enforcement action has been decreased significantly. But I believe that now many things got normalized, and especially if it's health-related issues, then the government actions will be increased. But I think the government is taking a somewhat bifurcated stance, because if it's health-related issues and all the publics are paying much attention to that issue, then the government would take very active enforcement action. On the other hand, if it's not related to healthcare issue, then probably there can be a criticism from the public if there is active enforcement action, that kind of enforcement action would deter the economic recovery.
Economic recovery. I understand.
Yeah.
I understand. That's an interesting perspective. I think one of the things that is important is in this dynamic environment where, in a market like Korea, where there's going to be a lot of changes. One is economic recovery is going to be a priority. Second, there is expected enforcement. There is also a lot of changes in the way the regulators are going to evolve over the next few months. In this given context, what are the few thoughts that you would want to suggest to compliance officers operating or overseeing this region?
Yeah, I think this is unprecedented risk, and this is totally new risk, and the government will issue a lot of new laws and regulation to cope with such risk. And so as a compliance officer, this is probably the most challenging times, because they should assess these new risks and learn these new laws and regulation to cope with the situation. But the thing that I would like to highlight is that the actual government action, if it's especially not related to healthcare issue, then the government action will be realized in 3 or 5 years later. So as a compliance officer, they should look forward in 3 or 5 years later, when the government got normalized and enforcement action got normalized again. And at that time, probably the regulator will not be as lenient as we expect now, because currently we believe that this is so pandemic, it's unprecedented, and probably everybody would understand it, everybody's are doing the same thing and so on. But after 3 or 5 years later, the government would take probably as stringent stance as before. So I think that as a compliance officer, they should be cautious about being lenient to any kinds of illicit activities occurring in their organization.
Absolutely. I think this is very, very interesting. At the end of the day, the point is very, very clear that the government enforcement, while it may appear a little lenient at this point in time, they're going to come back to it probably down the line. I think that's a
That's
very,
right.
very insightful point, Jeena. I really appreciate you sharing insights, and I'm sure the listeners would have a lot of thoughtful, interesting points coming out of this conversation. Thanks a lot for joining this show. I look forward to connecting with you soon again.
Okay, thank you. I will look forward to seeing you again.